I want to tell you a story. And it's not a story containing an amoeba or a pirate. Although I have to tell you, I won't sleep that well tonight, knowing that those kids will throw something at me tomorrow morning. But I want to tell you a story that relates to so many words and so many themes, tropes of this holiday. And it's a story that some of you know from a good book available on Amazon and at your fine booksellers called The Second Book of Samuel. And it's a story that's known through a beautiful song, the original words by Leonard Cohen, that beautiful song, Hallelujah. So here's that story behind Hallelujah. The story is of a king, King David. And King David goes on his rooftop one night, the roof of his palace, and he looks out and he sees a beautiful woman bathing on the rooftop of her home. In those days, that was in place of indoor plumbing and air conditioning. You'd go in hot countries, hot climates, and bathe on rooftops, but I want to suggest that we don't institute this in our hot climate or hot country. But what David sees is a beautiful woman across the hilltops, or I should say across the tops of these houses. And what he does determines an important part of his and our story. David asks his men to find out who the woman is and to invite her to the palace. And we know at that moment that David is going to and does have adultery with this woman. The woman is called Bathsheba, which means daughter of an oath. Think about that in relation to this story of adultery. So Bathsheba or Bathsheba is brought to David, and now David knows, he knew before having adultery with her that she's married to Uriah, her husband. And he does something that to most of us, I hope to all of us, when you hear it, you'll realize is unthinkable. He says to his men, take Uriah to the battlefront. Not just to war, but place him at the front where he's most likely to see battle and most likely to be killed. And they do that, and that's what happens in this story. So if the story ends there, none of us would be wearing a Star of David. And no grandchild or child would be named David after the king of Israel. And what happens is God notices David's actions, and God sends a prophet knocking at his door, a man called Nathan. And Nathan comes to the door of David's palace, and he comes in to see his king. And being a wise man and a prophet, he doesn't rebuke his king immediately. He's wise and subtle. He tells him a story. He tells the king a story about two men. One, a very rich man, and one, a very poor man, who live in the same village. And the very rich man has many sheep and many cattle, and the poor man has one ewe lamb, one female lamb, his prized possession. This lamb that he feeds with his own food, that he holds to his own chest, this lamb that he considers beloved, this lamb that he sips from his own cup, gives him water, the lamb that he sleeps with across his chest. And one day, a visitor comes to greet the wealthy man, and the wealthy man wants to prepare a meal for his visitor. So instead of going to his field with all of the sheep and the cattle that he has, he goes to the poor man's field for that one ewe lamb, and he takes it and slaughters it and prepares a meal for his guest. And David hears this story, and he has the reaction that probably you're having. He's incensed. He's riled. He says to Nathan, how can this man do this? How can it be possible that this man would have so little sensitivity? How can it be that this man would steal this beloved lamb from this man when he has his own? And Nathan the prophet looks in his king's eyes and probably very softly but directly says to him, you are that man. Imagine a moment in your life when somebody puts a mirror so close to your face and they say, don't look away. I'm trying to get you to see who you are. I'm trying to get you not to be callous in the way you're living your life. I'm trying to get you to read on the veins and eyes of your face the story that you're writing by virtue of the choices that you're making in your life. These days, we don't have prophets coming and knocking on our doors in coats and sandals to sit down and tell us prophecy. But we have Yom Kippur. That's what God sent in its place. Not a man to knock on the door or a woman, but a time, a presence of mind, an opportunity to realize that in the prayer book is a reflection of who we are. That if we look at the word to pray in Hebrew, it means to reflect, to judge ourselves. And on this day, with all this talk of sin and sin, for the sin of, and tomorrow morning, al chet shechatanu lefanecha, for the sins that we have committed against you, our tradition, and God, if we believe God is behind that tradition, is saying, stop. Stop for God's sake and realize who you are by virtue of the choices that you make. And realize that just one tiny shift in one foot already takes you in a different direction in your life. And realize what it is to forgive and what it is to apologize. And realize that what it is to sacrifice ego and lies on the altar of honesty and true relationship. The word for closeness in Hebrew is karov. The word for sacrifice is korban, from the same root. And the idea is that when we make a sacrifice of ourselves, when we take down the walls that surround us, when we become less callous and realize truth when we find ourselves in the mirror and in relationships with one another, and on these holy, auspicious, opportunity-filled nights and days in our lives, then we make the sacrifice of finding who we are, of taking off, as we read earlier in the book, the masks and the roles that cover us and dress us every day of life. So Yom Kippur came this year for a reason for you and for me. And I don't know the reason yet. I don't know what word, I don't know what spark, what melody, what moment of silence will spark me to look deeper than I did. I know that our tradition that says that God is the God of our nishkachot, God is the God that sees what we fail to remember of our actions, will remind me at some point, tap me on a shoulder left and right, and say, look, that word, that thought that you just allowed to escape to memory is asking you to realize something about yourself. In the Kol Nidre prayer earlier, I sang the words, Mi Yom Kippurim Zeh Ad Yom Kippur. And it's a strange phrase. Because in this prayer in which we speak of the vows that we've made before God and broken, we speak of the vows from this Yom Kippur day to the next. And the rabbis grapple on this text. They struggle with it. They say maybe it should be from this Yom Kippur back, looking backwards, because how can we possibly annul or even confess what we haven't yet done? But maybe the beauty of the tradition and the wisdom of the religion is to realize that we will break vows to God and to each other and to ourselves in the year to come. Maybe what it's saying is don't be children who believe that that change won't include falters and falls. Be adults who realize that in the year to come, you'll make the greatest intentions and resolutions, and sometimes in certain moments you will fail yourself. And then the message is, come back to the sanctuary where you're welcome. Think about the fact that David, that king, who was the protagonist in that strange story, the story of sin and of recognition and then of transformation, was the one to whom the rabbis say, our tradition says, that the Messiah will come as a descendant of the line of King David. Think about the beauty of that idea, that we say that when one day a Messiah will come into the world, it will be a descendant of that human, frail being called David. What it says to me is that the star that you saw up here when the evening began and the star that I wear on my chest doesn't just remind me of my identity, it reminds me of my potential. It reminds me that I stand in a line of men and women who came from a man and women who made mistakes just as all of us do, who faltered and sometimes fell. And because they lived in community as we live in community, because they realized the precious value of one another and not just oneself, they realized that they could step and hold on and climb back to life and to living. The title that in my mind I gave to this sermon is In Praise of Guilt, but Not Shame. Because I think guilt is worthy of praise. Guilt is a reaction to living in the wrong way. Guilt says to us, take your hand off the flame. Guilt says, I've done wrong, but shame says, I am wrong. Guilt says, I did something bad, but shame says, I am bad. And our tradition says that there's no place for shame in a human life. Our tradition says that the greatest danger is shame, because what shame does is isolates us and pulls us not only away from God, but from ourselves and from each other. Our tradition reaches out to us and says, realize that when you pray with the avarianim, with one another, with the sinners, you're praying as all human beings do among people who have made choices like you've made. Bad ones and good ones that make up a year of living. The tradition asks us on this night to look at ourselves and realize what it is to embrace and be changed and learned, to become more learned by virtue of guilt and reason. To realize when we've done wrong, we should have a feeling of discomfort, not just a thought of discomfort. Or we should go to somebody 3 rows back or 3 rows forward or just next to us and say, I need to talk to you. And I need to apologize. I need to sacrifice my ego, my uprightness, and bend myself before you and say, I apologize. And I ask by virtue of my humanity and my awareness that you accept my apology, but most of all, I apologize so that I realize who I am and whom I might be. I think about the danger of shame. I think about the fact that shame doesn't lead to positive change, but guilt does. I think about that shame always leads to disconnection, but guilt often creates connection through apology and conversation and forgiveness. I think about the fact that shame is internalized and comes to define who we are to ourselves, but guilt is often passing. And I realize and think about the fact that shame is never healthy. It's never useful. But guilt can be both healthy and useful. I think on this Yom Kippur about the fact that shame underlies a host of psychosocial problems, of abuse, of addiction, of depression, of infidelity, and even suicide. And what I realize is that shame is a trap, but guilt can often free us. All of us have an opportunity and in an opportunity of responsibility. And so often we look at the opportunity and the responsibility to be outward, to look in relationship to one another. If we have a spiritual sense of God, then perhaps we look up or around us and apologize to God, and even as the rabbis are wont to do, forgive God. But how often do we look to ourselves and forgive ourselves? How necessary is it, at least on one day, if not every day, to wake up in a given hour and say, I love and forgive and accept and admire and embrace the whole person that I brought into this holy space, this sanctuary. David's story is troubling. And if David's story was to end where I ended it, with the affair, with the adultery, with taking this wife and sending her husband off to battle, then we might never hear the name David again, because David's would be a story, a biography of shame. But the reason that David is such a beautiful notion, not just a name, such a beautiful idea of what a human being can be, the reason that we might name a child or a grandchild or a congregation after David is because David, in all of David's humanity, isn't a king, a lofty figure to whom we'll never reach, But David, when he stands and looks in a mirror, finds what you and I find in the mirror. A frail, contrite, beautiful human being. If you remember the book of Exodus, Moses came down the mountain with a set of tablets, and he saw the sin of the molten calf. He saw that the people had lost faith not only in God, but in themselves and in leadership, in Moses. And what Moses did in his anger, in his moment of frailty, was he took these precious tablets of the law and he sent them crashing down to the ground. But if you remember a year ago, when Pastor Dudley Rutherford stood up here and he had this fantastic golden model of the Ark of the Covenant, do you remember that? If you remember, what was in that wasn't just a set of tablets. It was 2 sets of tablets. Because what happened was Moses broke those tablets. And imagine what a man might feel when God wrote something and handed it to him. And he threw it down to the ground in a moment of rage. And Moses climbed back up the mountain and presented who he is, a frail human being, a whole person to God. And God said, let's do it again. But this time, I want it to be more precious to you. This time, I'll speak the words, and you will carve the words onto those tablets. And what you find in that Ark of the Covenant was that the people from that day forward didn't just carry what was beautiful and whole, God's laws on these beautiful, whole, intact tablets. They also carried with them the broken pieces that Moses collected from the side of a mountain, that he took in his hands and placed in a holy ark, so that the people realized not just their brokenness, but their wholeness, and not just their wholeness, but their brokenness. So that the people realized that they were a human being, a group of human beings on a journey that would continue to contain flaws and challenges, struggles and obstacles. And at the same time, they had these 2 beautiful tablets that reminded them that in that frailty and alongside it, they had to carry with them the beautiful notion that all of us can take from this day, the realization that we are precious and whole and necessary for this moment in this world. I said earlier that Nathan won't come knocking at your door unless Nathan is a neighbor. But over the next 25 hours between now and the end of the fast, you have prophets by way of silence, and prophets by way of walks, and prophets by way of swaying and singing, and prophets by ways of words in Aramaic and in English and in Hebrew, and all of those wise sages are asking you and asking me to face the beauty and the wholeness and the brokenness of who we are, and to begin again, to wear white and to make meaning of it, to realize not just a shroud as the rabbis understood the white, but also as some rabbis have understood it, a chrysalis, a safe place to develop as human beings. To come here, and if you want to put your talit over your head, to find what it is to be worn by human beings, but realize what it is to create a sanctuary for yourself. To realize the presence that we bring to holy moments that allow us to realize the presence and holiness of our lives. I wish all of you Gmar Chatima Tova. I wish you to be not written and inscribed, but sealed into the book of life. And I would say that I wish you an easy fast, but I don't wish anyone an easy fast unless they're ill. And if they're ill, they shouldn't fast. I want to tell you a story, an anecdote. Last night, Bron and I went to dinner. And as we were walking toward the door of a restaurant, to the left side of the restaurant was a woman in her 60s with sun-dyed hair and no teeth and a shopping cart. And I walked toward her, and she opened a shoebox, and in the shoebox, she had the little twisters that we put on the tops of bags from grocery stores, and she twisted and tied 2 little necklaces, handmade necklaces from little washers and metal. And she said, will you please buy these from me? It's all I have. It's the only way I have to make money. And I said, I don't have any money. And I asked her about herself, and then she saw bronze. She said, give one of these to your beautiful wife. And I said, we don't have any money, but are you hungry? And she said, yes. I said, we're going to dinner. Can we buy you dinner? And her face lit up, and she said a phrase that I've heard so many times in my life, but I heard it differently, and I haven't been able to let go of it since yesterday. She said, I am so hungry. And I realized that today I chose to fast. And at the moment that I want a meal, I'll open a fridge or put down a credit card and I'll have a meal. But that in this same moment in which I live with this comfort and opportunity, this incredible gift that people so close to us, minutes or miles or just feet away, don't know when another meal comes. And when they say, I'm starving, when they say, I'm hungry, they don't do it opening 2 doors of a grand fridge and looking at it saying, what will I eat? They look to one another, to us, to society, and say, when will I eat? So please don't wish me an easy fast. Wish me a meaningful one. And I ask the same for you. Let's find meaning and let's find what it is to be human through this fast. Let's suffer a little and realize how many people suffer so much. Let's realize the beauty and the gift and the blessing of being able to choose to struggle through a day of fast. Gmar Chatima Tova.